Super Metroid is one of the most widely acclaimed games of all time. It is often seen as the pinnacle of Metroidvanias, a game genre defined by a mostly open-ended map structure that allows for more exploration when you obtain specific items or abilities. If I were to add it to my list of favorite games, it would easily be at the very top, mostly because it was empty before and I don't really make a lot of lists. There's a lot of good reasons Super Metroid is so loved. It is environmental storytelling far ahead of its time, it has an iconic and atmospheric soundtrack, and meticulous level design. And that level design and the way it uses the player moveset is one of the most interesting aspects to talk about. It's a game that encourages exploration, but also deliberately guides the player through a specific intended path. Super Metroid has a large map with item-based barriers that can be difficult to navigate, but it also has a variety of different ways to get you back on track. If you're feeling lost, there's a lot of different options available to you. There's a world map that suggests where secrets might be if you use a little critical thinking. The barriers are memorable enough to recall easily when needed, and you can also randomly bomb things all around the map, which will reveal what item you need to destroy something. And if all else fails, you will eventually unlock the X-ray scope, which will straight up show all the secrets in the room. But truly getting lost, unable to find any way to progress, is pretty rare. Super Metroid is very good at teaching players how to navigate and explore through its design. It will often close the player off into a smaller subsection of the map, forcing the player to experiment in different ways, which can feel frustrating at times, but can also be very effective. Are you stuck in a room after getting the morph ball? Well, it turns out you can use it to slide through small spaces. Can't get back to the surface after getting bombs? Well, try bombing everything until you find out you can destroy these blocks with them. It all comes together to create a well-designed cycle where you get new items all the time and have a pretty good idea about where you might be able to access new places with them. But what's really interesting are the barriers that you might think that you can only get past with specific items, but can actually get past with a little creativity and experience. Super Metroid has a few different hidden techniques that allow for a surprising amount of movement. Wall jumps, which you can use at the very beginning of the game, are the most notable and the focus of this video, but there are a couple of others as well. Super Metroid's wall jumps are pretty unintuitive compared to most games, so most players won't know how they work at the very start of the game. Instead of simply pressing yourself against a wall and jumping, you need to get a running start, jump towards the wall, turn away from it until you get this animation, then jump. It's simple enough once you learn how to do it, but players are unlikely to learn by themselves. So the first time most players will encounter wall jumps is in this room about halfway through the game. Once you get here, there isn't a way to proceed otherwise, so these animal friends demonstrate how to actually use the wall jump that you've technically had access to the whole game. It doesn't matter too much at first since you already have a lot of different movement boosting items at this point in the game, but if you decide to play again having learned how to wall jump, you can discover whole new ways to play. Take this room, the entrance to Kraid's lair. On first look, it seems like you can just almost get to the top just by jumping, but not quite. What you're supposed to do is explore more and find the appropriately named high jump boots, which will increase your jumping ability, but if you know about the wall jump, you have another option. You can skip getting the high jump boots entirely and just wall jump off the ledge and into the entrance. Instead of going along the intended sequence, you've broken it and found your own way through. That means you can skip all of this. And that kind of maneuver is called a sequence break, which I define as the feeling of disrupting the intended order of progression. Now, a lot of Super Metroid sequence breaking was almost certainly intended by the designers, but they're unintuitive and untelegraphed enough where they feel unintended. In order to do these kinds of skips, the game mechanics are being abused in such a way that is so different than what is usually required that it feels like the rules of the game are being broken. And this is what I feel the appeal of sequence breaking is. Games are often thought of as systems and rules that a player is navigating around, like some kind of magic circle that we are putting around it. But when we find out that we can break those rules, that we can find our own way through the object, there is a kind of joy in that freedom. There are a lot of great things about Super Metroid, but the sequence breaking specifically is what makes it one of my favorite games. Even now, years after I first played it, I can run around and discover new ways to play. In fact, I only just now, during the making of this video, learned that you can beat every boss in the exact opposite order as intended. It seems like there's always something new I haven't found, even when I have technically found everything. But not everyone shares that same joy. There are, for whatever reason, a lot of people who absolutely hate the movement in Super Metroid. It's a lot floatier than most platformers, including those in the Metroid series, and that combined with the atypical wall jumping mechanics causes a lot of people to bounce off the game. Of course, these people are wrong. Super Metroid is perfect and I will not accept otherwise. But I also understand where they're coming from and think that's a valuable perspective to have. For all the influence Super Metroid has had on the genre, this aspect has often been abandoned. Games in general have gotten increasingly approachable and intuitive to play, which has done a lot of good for the industry. But it also means we've left behind a lot of interesting design. Super Metroid's weird movement quirks, while off-putting to many, are essential to the joy of discovering its sequence breaks. It means that a new player has a more structured experience to guide them, while an experienced player can do so much more. But as modern video game controls have gotten more streamlined, it's a lot harder to have these kind of experiences. Even with the massive growth of the Metroidvania genre, it's still rare to have these kinds of affordances for sequence breaking in their design. Let's look at Hollow Knight, for example. As anyone who has ever played it will tell you, Hollow Knight is not an easy game. But it is a very intuitive game to play, with a lot of modern design sensibilities. If you want to use a specific ability, you can be reasonably sure that it will work in exactly the way you expect, without any weird contextual controls. This is great. I love Hollow Knight, but it also means that most players will likely only play in a way that has already been accounted for in its design. The skips are so unintuitive that no casual player is going to have the same joy sequence breaking it as they might in Super Metroid. Now, that's not a flaw with the game. It's simply a design choice that doesn't personally cater to me. I would also enjoy it if Hollow Knight, say, paid my rent, or got me to stop procrastinating on making this fucking video, but we don't always get what we want, do we? So, in this video, I'm going to be looking at a few different games that can help us better understand sequence breaking. Again, this is not necessarily a problem that needs to be fixed, but I do hope to find an additional design space that allows for more accessible skips. How do we make modern, intuitive controls that can also allow for casual players to discover the joy of sequence breaking? And I want to start with what I think is the key to this: player movement. This is the aspect that most people have a problem with in Super Metroid, so I think that's a good place to start. And that brings us to Pseudoregalia. Pseudoregalia is one of the best Metroidvanias I've ever played, and that's solely because it feels so good to play and move around it. I don't even know what the game is about. It has a very Dark Souls approach to the story, which means that I'm sure it has one, but it requires reading. So it basically doesn't exist. But you know what does exist? That's right, Xeno, movement. You have so many movement options that can be used in so many creative ways. I'm still discovering new tricks after multiple playthroughs. I honestly can't think of another game that feels nearly as good to play. I think I'd even be willing to play around in one empty room in Pseudoregalia more than the best level of most other platformers. It's a masterclass in making sequence breaking both accessible and rewarding. And despite its retro design, it perfectly combines modern design sensibilities with the spirit of classic Metroidvanias. In fact, if I were to add to my list of favorite games, it would probably be my least favorite game of all time. I'm sorry, Pseudoregalia, you have some pretty stiff competition here. It's a short list. I'll still probably give you a 10 out of... maybe like a 9 out of 10 or something. It's still an amazing game. I just used the whole 10-point scale instead of a 4.1 in disguise. Also, I'm going to put it below Hollow Knight. I'm not selling this game very well, am I? Well, believe me when I say that Pseudoregalia is special. It sets itself apart from the competition with its incredibly versatile moveset. You can perform wall jumps, double jumps, dashes, ground pounds, these wall slide things, and more. These abilities are intuitive and easy to use, but they also have a lot of depth for those willing to experiment. You can only use a set amount of them in one leap, but you can perform a wide variety under the right conditions. It's similar to something like Mario Odyssey in its design, being easy to learn but hard to master. And if you played Mario Odyssey before, that might seem strange, because it's an incredibly easy game to break. How can this kind of player freedom be accounted for in a Metroidvania, a genre that is so reliant on restricting movement to gate progression? This isn't like Super Metroid, where a new player is limited by their lack of mechanics-related knowledge. It's pretty easy to figure out your limits given a bit of time. The game doesn't hold your hand, but it does provide a playground where you can learn and master these moves through practice. You learn by doing, often in a natural and engaging way. What makes Pseudoregalia special is how it integrates sequence breaking into the core gameplay experience. From the outset, the game encourages you to explore and experiment. The level design is clever and open-ended, often presenting you with obstacles that have multiple solutions. There are set intended paths, but there are also numerous shortcuts and skips that skilled players can find and use. For example, at this point in the game, I have two upgrades: the high jump and the wall jump. I know those aren't the official names, but that's what they are. I'm trying to get as much height as possible, then using wall jumps to navigate around the curved wall to get on the ledge. And I keep trying and I keep getting really close, but I'm just barely out of reach. Now what you're supposed to do is explore and unlock the wall slide, allowing you to move long horizontal distances whenever there's a wall. If you have access to this ability, it's easy going. It's just an obvious extension of your movement options. But I don't actually need the wall slide. If you're really precise in your movements and you're efficient with your jumps, you can scale the ledge without the upgrade, accessing areas much earlier than intended. I know it doesn't look too bad here, but believe me, it is way easier to screw up than you think. But if you're willing to take on that added difficulty, you have many more options to explore. This not only rewards skill and creativity, but also makes every playthrough unique. But there is one small problem. Sequence breaking in Pseudoregalia is hard. The very definition of a Metroidvania encourages players to stop at the first sign you can't do something and look for an item that will help them proceed. So how do we get them to keep trying? How do we get a risk-averse player to stop exploring for a moment so they can try a new challenge? Well, that's easy. Make exploring even more frustrating and annoying. Get them lost. They'll stop thinking on a macro level and start thinking about what's right in front of them. Do you want to take the path of least resistance? Fine. It'll be an unmarked path and you don't have a map. And that's not a metaphor. There's literally not a map. Or at least there wasn't on release, but there was one added months later. If you waitlisted this game and played it right after, you played without one of the basic features of basically every other modern game. And even when Pseudoregalia updated with a map, it's still frustratingly insufficient. And when you don't have any direction and you're lost without anywhere to go, you're probably a lot more willing to try one of those difficult jumps. And like, look around. Do you really want to explore this place? It all looks the same. The PS1 game aesthetic with the same texture covering every room means there's barely any landmarks to recognize where you are. It's so frustrating. Why would you do this? Why would you force me to keep banging my head against this wall? It's so hard! Ah! Part 2. Failure and difficulty. I know there wasn't a part 1, but it's too late for that. We're gonna start with part 2, deal with it. The canonical text on failure and difficulty is Jesper Juhl's The Art of Failure. It's an incredibly influential book, and clearly and succinctly explains the paradox of failure. Why do we engage with difficult games even if they frustrate us? And how can we get risk-averse players to engage with challenging situations? This book provides satisfying and illuminating answers to these questions, and I consider it an essential text for anyone interested in reading about games. But I'm going to cite Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy instead. It's a video game, so it's more fun to watch than listen to. I'm sorry, Juhl, but books don't have B-roll. Who's gonna put you in their video essay, fucking Daredevil? Getting Over It is a game that embraces difficulty and frustration by design. You control a man in a cauldron using only a hammer to climb up the surreal mountain of obstacles. The controls are incredibly unique and require a great deal of precision and practice to master. This puts you in the maddening position of knowing it's possible to get over these obstacles, but being unable to execute it in practice. Just like Pseudoregalia. And as you climb and fail and climb again, Bennett Foddy explains why he thinks that frustration adds to the game and makes it fun.
A funny thing happened to me as I was building this mountain. I'd have an idea for a new obstacle, and I'd build it, test it, and it would usually turn out to be unreasonably hard. But I couldn't bring myself to make it easier. It already felt like my inability to get past a new obstacle was my fault as a player rather than as a builder. Imaginary mountains build themselves from our efforts to climb them, and it's our repeated attempts to reach the summit that turns those mountains into something real.
Most obstacles and Metroidvanias are fake. You see something that's stopping your progress, and you turn away until you have the required item to continue. It's a wall. A wall is a place you know you can't go to. You probably won't even think about it. It may as well not even exist. But what about a hurdle? A hurdle is real. you have to think about a hurdle. Can I get past it? Will I be able to get around it without too much trouble? Should I try to get some assistance? Or should I find another way around? In that way, the obstacles in Pseudoregalia are real. They are not walls, they are hurdles to overcome, providing new challenges for players to face. And that's what I think makes Pseudoregalia so great. The friction comes from mastering more advanced moves to get past these hurdles. It's not as punishing as some games, but it does require practice and precision. This balance of accessibility and challenge makes sequence breaking feel incredibly rewarding. You're not just following a set path, you're carving out your own route through the game's world. This constant reinforcement of exploration and experimentation keeps the gameplay fresh and exciting. It's something I wish more games would attempt. Pseudoregalia successfully captures the joy of sequence breaking in a way that feels both modern and respectful of its Metroidvania roots. It shows that with thoughtful design, it's possible to create games that are accessible to new players while still offering depth and freedom for experienced players. By focusing on intuitive controls, open-ended level design, and rewarding exploration, Pseudoregalia provides a template for how future games can embrace the art of sequence breaking.